Ruling soon. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the teenager who threw the rock cannot be identified. Right. Like the 100 or more people who filed in and out of that courtroom each day didn't know that the person sitting beside Hank Elliott was a ward of the court named Chad Kennedy. Not getting your name and picture in the paper didn't exactly mean no one knew who you were. It was like being invisible in plain sight. People knew all right, like the kids during those last few days at school who'd suddenly grown silent when he'd walked by, their eyes following down the hall. Lately, he'd even begun to sense a coolness among some of his own buddies, like Zeus Williams, who had nearly beaten that guy to death last year with a bat. Last week, Reef had walked over to see what was left of the pit, and Zeus had been standing by the barricade watching cranes loading the rubble onto a fleet of trucks. Zeus had said hey, and they shot the shit for a while about the pit being gone, but there'd been something in the air between them, like a word that hadn't been spoken, invisible in plain sight. Zeus had left after a few minutes, and Reef hadn't seen him since. Well, fuck him. You don't know how lucky you got it, and fuck you too, Carl. The phone on the kitchen wall rang, mercifully interrupting Carl's postmortem on the sad state of youth as he saw it. Carl reached for it. Hello, he said. Then, yeah, he's here. Handing Rafe the phone, he muttered, It's your lawyer. They're called external fixators, Dr. Mahoney said. Lisa had slept nearly 2 hours. Her tongue felt thick and her mouth was dust dry, but she was awake and alert. Now that the curtain had lifted, though, she longed for its return. Her eyes widened in horror as she gazed down at the ruin that was her body. Holding up the bedsheet, the doctor moved on to her other injuries, pointing to the cast that encased Lisa's left arm and carefully describing the dislocated shoulder and the 2 breaks that occurred above and below the elbow. But all Lisa could see was the metal hardware that seemed to grow out of her pelvis and left leg. I know, the doctor said softly. It can be frightening the first time you see them. Her mother stood on the other side of the bed, holding her right hand. She focused on Lisa's eyes, silently communicating her support. Somehow, though, Lisa sensed that her mother was not looking at her as much as away from what lay under the sheet. Clearly, her mother had already seen her injuries, could not bring herself to look at them again. More tears slipped down Lisa's face as she stared at several metal bars that crisscrossed the left side of her lower body. Thick as ballpoint pens, the bars were connected to metal rods about 3 inches long that protruded directly from her flesh. They go right? Lisa choked, tried bravely not to sob. She took a shaky breath, let it out slowly. Right into my skin? Yes, they do. They were surgically implanted to keep the bone in your leg and pelvis aligned so they heal properly. They'll be taken out after they've done their job. Lisa continued to stare at them, her lower lip quivering. She barely heard the doctor as she continued with the explanation of her injuries. Along with the fractures, 2 of your ribs were broken, and you had a severe concussion that caused a swelling in your brain and resulted in the coma. She paused a moment as if to let the reality of Lisa's injuries sink in. Then, your ribs, arm, and shoulder are healing nicely, and we've been exercising your legs each day to keep them strengthened. We bring in a portable machine called a CPM that provides continuous passive movement so your muscles don't atrophy. You'll see it later. Her head raised on pillows, Lisa continued to stare at the roadmap of incisions beneath the fixators and the fading blue-yellow bruises that ran up both legs and across her pelvis. The muffled throb of her body that had set her teeth on edge all morning was forgotten as her eyes traced and retraced the damage below her waist. Even the earlier humiliation of the catheter. We have to change it 4 times a day, Joyce had explained as she'd inserted the plastic tube, was a dim memory. I know it looks bad, Lisa, the doctor admitted, but you'll heal. You've already begun doing that. The important thing is to get you walking again. At last, Lisa's mother spoke. They're transferring you to the rehab center tomorrow, honey. The sooner you start therapy, the sooner we're going to get you home. Lisa's eyes did not leave the wreckage of her lower body. She choked and her mother squeezed her hand lightly. Yes, dear, what is it you want? But the dam broke and Lisa was sobbing, unable to continue. Dr. Mahoney lowered the sheet and reached around behind her, pulling something out of her drawer in the side table. This is what you want, isn't it, Lisa? She held out a mirror.